go on to the question of how our work and through Chicano studies and so on in our community and our connecting our work inside the university to our work with our communities. I know one of the things that Jesus wants us to be sure and talk about is how our work contributes overall to the movement. So if we can do that, keep in mind the preambles. If you want to make any comments about the preambles, if there's anything you want to say about your own work that you haven't said yet that you want to do. But let's pose the question. How has what we have done, either individually, collectively, most especially collectively, how has it contributed to overall la causa, the Chicano movement, the advancement of Chicanos and Chicanos, our people, in this context?
When I was teaching at SMU, a private school, an elitist school, I got connected because I was director of Mexican American Studies also at the same time. Always connected to community, right? And because I was very visible and active, I got asked to do a lot of things with community. One of them was to be on the police community relations committee that was ongoing at that time. So I said, yeah, sure, let's do it. And they said, we have some important work because the police are killing 6 or 7 Mexicans and blacks every year through the chokehold that they use to subdue people, right? And so that was #1 item on the agenda. We met for a year with the police chief and a table just like this with about just as many people from the Mexican American Hispanic community. And we brought data together. It took us a whole year. But at the end of the year, the police chief agreed they would ban the chokehold forever. And that didn't come out in the newspapers. It's not publicized anywhere. But it's work for me that was like, this is why I exist. This is what the work that we need to be doing to save lives, to prevent police brutality, and that kind of shit, you know. So that's one of the things that...
Maybe Edward and I can dovetail off of that one.
Yeah.
We both did that work. I was on the National Task Force for the Urban League and the National Council de la Raza and the President Carter's Task Force on Crime, Corrections, and Hispanics. And in all of that work, my kind of focus was on police killings of young unarmed Mexicans, Americans, Chicanos. And we did make some headway in policy. Now, the uniform crime reports for the FBI had said that there was 17 killings. We went through newspapers of the Southwest, just the major cities, not the, the Cristals, and cities that are all Mexican, small towns, just the big ones. And we came up with 95 cases. So that was 70 that didn't get reported. So we did make some policy differences. One of the big struggles we had when I was on we submitted those papers to the Congress, and they got put in the dialogue, because back in the 70s through the 80s, there were more killings of young blacks and Chicanos than now. It's a lot better now, but we have social media now, so every case gets, headlines.
Well, I was involved in a variety of issues on the local level in Indiana, in Gary, Indiana, with instances of brutality and killings of Chicanos and Mexican immigrants in that particular case, and also in Arizona. The goal of my work was to try to understand where that impetus from the police comes from, right, and more importantly, how it has affected the Chicano community, and use that as a way of analyzing and bringing historical notions of how this all came about, so that then we could do something about it. It could be done something about it by people at the policy level as opposed to the history. And then to continue to understand the way police have evolved and the culture of police have evolved since then to sort of, they've adopted this totem of being the thin blue line, and which has a lot of ramifications in terms of how they see themselves as the arbiters between the civilized society and mayhem and barbarism, which is us, blacks, and other people. And you see that carried on in a lot of policies that develop in the police, and it creates a culture within the police department of them against us, and that we were successful in doing that there, and then creating a department that is now turned into a school that has had profound effects by creating students who've been able to go out in the community and be activists in their own right, affecting policy on issues ranging from health to police to teaching. And it's one of the major accomplishments of my life that I'm very proud of.
One of the things that I think is really important about what you just said there at the end, and I think probably everybody can say that, in fact, people have made reference to that, which is that the ways in which through our classes and through our teaching, how there's all these people out there now who are out there in various capacities in the community affecting policy. I mean, you mentioned all the state legislators, for example, that came out of Chicano studies, or Chicano studies majors, the former students in yours.
Yeah.
And I dare say that's something that we can all say, and is a really important aspect of what our contributions have been to not only sort of immediate issues, but the long-term addressing of issues facing our communities.
I deal a lot with this in history as an issue among our people, the denial of one's worth. God, that's what brought out the argument of dignity as important as equal material rights. Mm-hmm. The question of dignity and self-worth. Violence is the worst thing you can do to a person, aside from denying them their worth. You're denying them life.
Yeah.
So that it speaks to the fundamental value in our history that our people have raised. We are worth something. Tenemos dignidad. We're autonomous. We have, what is the word that we use in politics? Sovereigns. Yeah. I mean, that's the point of departure in much of political philosophy. But our people express that as a central value that almost goes without saying.
I want to get some more voices in. Can we talk, especially women voices? Can we talk about some more again about this issue, how our work has contributed to the movement? How our work has contributed to the movement, to the advancement of our people.
Following up on that, in the book that we published, Latina, Telling to Live, Latina Feminist Testimonios, there's a whole section called Alchemy of Erasure. And we purposely, as the 18 of us came together and we thought about the things that we were facing in academia. I mean, there's a whole story to how the book came about, but one of the things we noticed is how we as women have been erased from our histories, and how other women have been erased from our histories. It's as if we weren't there, right? But we know we're there, you know. And so I think that has to be addressed, right? I think it really has to be addressed because and it's not, I mean, it's, if we're gonna write our history, we have to write the history. It has to be a full history.
I think women play a very important role in the maturation process, absolutely, of the larger
Well, and there are, I
movement.
mean, the projects like the Chicana por mi raza,
Yes.
Maria Cotera and
Yes.
Linda Merchant and forgetting who all, but anyway, that's
Yes.
important. And then there are scholars like Brenda Sendejo and Irene Lara and Dion, who have done series of interviews with women. But all of that, I don't think hasn't come out yet, but I know they have.
But what about some other issues now? Lala, you talked earlier about some of the work you've done around substance abuse, around drugs, and then before that you did gang research.
Yeah,
These
well,
are
you know,
also
What you say about hip hop, John Hagedorn, of course, I don't know if you know him, he's a sociologist, written a lot about crime and youth and gangs and stuff, and he ends his book his book about how if we don't really understand hip hop, we won't really understand youth. Right, and many of us are so elitist, right? We kind of discard it, but it's really so much part of the youth culture that exists, right? And I think that's an important thing to remember, right? That we are an older generation, right? And there's another generation out there that may be distinct from us, right? They didn't grow up there in the 50s and 60s, and they have a different view, and they grew up with this technology and all of these kinds of new ways of viewing the world and interacting with the world that we need to take in consideration. And in fact, we need to step back and really listen to them, right? That's one thing. The other thing too, I think in terms of violence and the drug and the whole thing that's going on with, is it's not something that happened by coincidence. It is something that's very structural. I mean, we had the war on poverty, remember that, right? And that was followed up by the war on crime, right? By Nixon started it, or Reagan and Nixon, and then the war on drugs. And all of a sudden we have this whole set of laws, I mentioned this before, that emerged that didn't exist before, that criminalized behavior that was not criminal in the past. And you can see that in our schools. Schools, in our schools we have now police, and what the impact that's having on our youth, and what is it called? The pathways to incarceration begin now in our schools because of the kinds of laws that have been passed. I mean, you can look at the incarcerations. Look at who's in prison, right? These are all of our. There's a whole, and I argue this in my work that I do, that there's an underclass. Maybe I'm influenced by Joe and Morgan, you know that, but there's an underclass of us, right? That somehow has not been able to benefit from kind of the positive things that have happened to our community. There's a big chunk of people, and they're not the A students, the Chicano A students. They're not the what is these immigrants? These new immigrants are being deported. What do they call it? They're people that just stuck down on the bottom and have not been able to emerge into that middle ground. And there's a big gap, right? There's a big gap. There's those of us that have become professors, that become lawyers and things like this. There's a big chunk down there that does that is still there. And I don't know, I guess I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but I'm saying that we have to start paying attention to that and really, look at the impact that deindustrialization has had of our communities and the loss of jobs. Look at Los Angeles. I mean, there were no jobs there before. Those of you that grew up in Los Angeles, remember everybody was working. Our parents were all working in those factories and all those guys. Even if they didn't have an education, they're working in the tire industry, the automobile industry. Now those jobs don't exist. And so you got this whole kind of structural thing that's going on that I think Chicano studies, I guess is a challenge. How do Chicano studies frame that? How do we incorporate that into the way that we think? In public health, we think about downstream and upstream. And the downstream is where the bodies come down, but we have to deal with some of the issues upstream, of what is really kind of behind some of these things. I just throw that out.
Can I follow up on what you're saying? Because of public health, there are very few of us in our organization that have done public health. I did public health for 30 years because my dad died of cancer in 1988. And I was an immigration researcher, and I switched to cancer prevention research. I was very fortunate to work with some really good people who brought me under their wing, Dr. Bakemeyer, one of them, and taught me how to do cancer prevention research. But it took me into the whole public health arena. And the problems there of connecting, how do we connect what we know to our community, the people that are disenfranchised, they're out there. How do you take public health messages to them? I had to learn all of that sort of thing, which was fascinating, but it did mean that one of the things that we did was to go into like La Junta, Lamar, Las Animas, La Junta, all southern Colorado, and organize women's groups. Because you get the messages of public health through women the best and fastest. We learned that, I learned that. And so we would work through churches, the CBOs of the various little pueblitos, and have meetings. And then we got the radio programs to run our messages, and the newspapers to run our messages so that we could do breast, cervical, and prostate cancer prevention in our community bilingually, biculturally. But you have to filter down into those various layers, as you know, to get those messages and to change the behavior, which is the hardest thing. You know, we always know that you have to change an attitude, but you have to change the behavior if you want people to screen. Go get your cervical exam, get your mammogram, get your prostate exam. And those were tough to do among the men. That was another task that we had to do with our work. But it was, I think, for me, it's just another learning on the learning curve, having to learn all this stuff. But you're posing the question correctly, because, I mean, with what you're doing with the deindustrialization, the joblessness, that's at the forefront of where the change needs to come. And how we resolve that remains to be seen yet.
No, I mean, what happens when all of that, the deindustrialization, and what happens to individual families, Chicano families, right, and their kids, and you know, that's so important to understand before we can really come up with kind of how to really solve this, right? And that's what's difficult, and it's a real challenge, because I mean, you talk about cancer. Well, you can just put a map on LA. You can see where all the cancer is down in Wilmington, right around the docks. I mean, you have cancer rates that are like incredible if you look at that data, right? But so yeah, it's a real challenge for us, and how to deal with it. And I mean, I could talk more about, you know, the whole issue of violence and the availability of guns, and, you know, again, how the media is and the responses and that kind of the hopelessness that's around. You know, how do you explain, you know, people, you know, argue and pull out guns on each other, right? And it's our own community, brothers and sisters, you know. I mean, you know, it's us killing each other, right? And so that's really kind of the challenge. And I think that population somehow is not on our agenda. We don't really think of that agenda. You know, we think of the dreamers. We think of, you know, trying to get people into the universities and things. So, I mean, I don't remember us talking about this, you know, back in the day, right, when we were all very active in NACCS. These are kind of new issues, I think.
Pat, and then Tomas.
So one of the set of structural violences that I think we've contributed significantly to is to gendered violence and the many ways in which there has been a war on women, particularly women of color. So occupational segregation, the wages that women receive, et cetera, control over their reproductive health. One of the things I learned in the research I did for my last book is there's a whole generation of activists out there who have taken our classes in ethnic studies, feminist studies, who know intersectionality and all the different decolonial theories that we have been teaching and writing about, and they're bringing them into communities with working class, low-income women of color, and they're organizing. And so it's really beautiful to see both that effect, but also to talk with low-income Spanish-speaking women in colonias who can talk about decoloniality in very broad terms and their human right to access, you know, state interventions and the right to dignity. So there's a way in which there are these tremendous kinds of changes occurring in our communities that we directly helped fuel. And I think we should acknowledge that, but also look for where else do we need to go. And at the moment when the Supreme Court is basically about to go off a ledge, I think the stakes are very high.
It ruled today.
Ruled today. Yeah, go ahead, Aida.
No, I'll just say real quick, interviewing young men, going back to your point of how do we hook younger people, I think to me, what's very inspiring about our group is that we're growing old in a different way. If you think about almost anybody that was our age when we were younger.
They were dead.
Well, they were dead, yes, because we're lasting longer. But I also think there's this kind of energy and kind of youthfulness and engagement with life that I feel out of step with my age. Because I really still have a very big investment in young people. But it's very lopsided by gender. I think that young women, I can think of NACCS, you can think of the community organizers, that there is a weird way in which I feel I have overcome that barrier with young women, and I have a lot of young friends, assistant professors that we hang out together, that we mentor each other and stuff. I think there's a real gap with young men, that older men are not as invested in mentoring or very actively pursuing young men, and that to me contributes to this underclass. And these are men, including my husband, who's like perfect in every way, but no se le ocurre. Like, he doesn't think about everything I'm doing, I should take 2 or 3 young men with me, because who's going to follow me? Whereas everywhere I go, I take young women with me everywhere, right? And that came through in the interviews I did with young men, where they have suffered violence, and sexual violence, like when they get stopped by the cops. Several of them talked about being fondled by the cops, and it was the first time they ever mentioned it, that had happened to them, and they were traumatized by it, and they had nowhere to go, and they had no language, because it's not sexual harassment, it's not in their heads in terms of, that kind of sexual assault. There's no office for them to go to, there's no literature, and it made me feel sad that they're so without guidance. And so to me, that's an opening for us, that, we do well now that, we shook the cage. We're aware of gender issues in terms of young women and women. We still have a long ways to go. But what about these young men that are without guidance, right? And so, I don't know, that's like an aperture for us, right? And it's something for us to think about in terms of how we want to age and what role do we want to play in that aging.
Thank you, Aida. Thank you so much. Tomas and then David.
I just have an observation I just wanted to share, and it was actually picking up on something that Esteban just said. A lot of us, we're talking about structural violence, we're talking about health disparities, we're talking about crime and social justice issues with the police and stuff, and I sometimes get the sense, and even from the blurbs here, that we somehow come into the academy, we look at the world and say, okay, well, we have a structural, political economy, we know how to think about it, and we just approach these things kind of in the blind. We pick and choose what we want, and yet it's really clear to me, at least certainly I'll be the first to admit, in my own work, everything that I do is autobiographical. Everything, the biographical underpinnings of what we do, and you mentioned someone passing and that moved you in a different direction, and certainly doing stuff on Ventura County is where I was from, fault lines, that's what it's all about. All the gay stuff, it's like notes from therapy, so, there's that other dimension. And I think the women's group, the testimonials and the other, that stuff gets closer to that kind of voice and that kind of appreciation and where and what's legitimate. But there is a way in which, particularly the man, this, I'm structural, this, I think we're just like detached observers coming in and answering problems of the world, where there's just really underbelly of personal baggage and shit that's there that we just don't talk about, and it hasn't been mentioned here. I think.
Thank you, Tomas. David and then Zalala.
I just want to remind us about how far we have come. I know we have a lot of work to do still, but remember when we were graduate students, we couldn't have had this kind of meeting. We didn't have the kind of academics or scholars, really. We had a couple, but not look at what we're doing. And when we're having this meeting, we're having it at a center. We didn't have centers before, but now we got a building here. We got an infrastructure, we're developing an infrastructure, and we're part of that intellectual infrastructure. And so that's why we can address all these various issues, drug abuse, gang, police violence, and so forth, And let's not forget that, in getting back to what Emilio said, isn't it interesting that we all entered the academy and we had some kind of similarities even though we were in different places? Well, part of it has to do because of the movimiento. I think all of us were,
That's right.
many of us were part of that movimiento. And so we entered the academy because we were concerned about our communities already. You know, and remember Praxis was the big thing?
Right.
Initially, Praxis, uniting theory with action. I mean,
Reflection, yeah.
yeah, that was,
And
so I just wanted to.
Most all of us came out of the working class.
Yeah, yeah.
That's
I-
right, working
can I-
class movements.
can I
Yeah,
follow up
yeah,
on something
especially in
that-
Arizona,
Yeah.
unions.
Can I-
So let me-
That is a-